Right now, you are one of 8 billion. 8 billion faces. 8 billion separate lives unfolding at this exact second. A crowd so vast that if you tried to meet every person alive, shaking one hand every second without sleeping or stopping, you would die of old age long before you reached the end of the line. But there was a moment, not so long ago in the life of our species, when every human being on Earth could have fit inside a single football stadium. And the real story of how you traveled from that stadium to these 8 billion is far stranger than simple survival. It begins with the sky going dark. Picture the world 74,000 years ago. Your ancestors were already here. They looked almost exactly like you. The same hands, the same eyes, the same restless, dreaming brains turning over inside the same skulls. They had fire. They had language. They had already buried their dead, painted their skin, and stared up at the very same stars you sometimes glance at on your walk home. They were not cavemen in the cartoon sense. They were people. And then on an island that would one day be called Sumatra, the ground tore open beneath them. The mountain we now call Toba did not erupt the way you might imagine an eruption. Forget the glowing red river of lava sliding gently down a slope. This was something else entirely. This was the single largest volcanic event our species has ever lived through, and one of the largest in tens of millions of years. In a matter of days, Toba threw roughly 3,000 cubic kilometers of rock, dust, and ash into the air. That number is almost impossible to feel, so let me translate it. The eruption that buried the Roman city of Pompeii was a candle. Toba was a bonfire thousands of times larger. Ash rained down across an entire ocean and an entire subcontinent. Geologists have found a layer of it blanketing India, more than 3,000 kilometers from the volcano, in places thick enough to bury your ankles. So, ask yourself a simple question. What happens to a living planet when that much debris is hurled into the sky all at once? The answer is that the sun begins to vanish. The finest particles of ash and droplets of sulfur climbed high into the upper atmosphere, far above the rain that might have washed them out, and spread on the winds until they wrapped the whole globe in a thin gray veil. That veil did something quiet and terrible. It turned away the sunlight before it could reach the ground. Scientists have a name for what follows. They call it a volcanic winter. The geologist Michael Rampino, who spent much of his career modeling exactly this kind of aftermath, argued that Toba could have cooled the entire planet by several degrees, with some regions plunging far colder than that for years without relief. Try to live inside that for a moment. Imagine summers that never quite arrive. Imagine the greens slowly retreating from the hills, the forest thinning, the herds you depend on growing lean and scarce, and then disappearing. For a creature that stays alive by gathering plants and hunting animals, a few cold years are not an inconvenience. They are a sentence whispered over an entire species. How many of your ancestors do you think simply did not wake up through those long gray winters? And here is where the story takes the turn that made it famous around the world. In 1998, an anthropologist named Stanley Ambrose, working at the University of Illinois, proposed something that stopped people cold. He had noticed a strange fact hidden inside your own body and inside the body of every person you have ever met. Compared to almost any other animal, human beings are astonishingly similar to one another. This sounds wrong, because we see difference everywhere. Different skin, different faces, different hair. But beneath the surface in the actual letters of our DNA, the variation is tiny. A single troop of chimpanzees living in one African forest can carry more genetic diversity than the entire human population spread across all 7 continents. Why would a species that conquered the whole planet carry so little variety in its genes? Ambrose offered an answer that sent a chill through his field. He suggested that our ancestors had passed through what scientists call a bottleneck, a moment when the human population crashed so violently that perhaps only a few thousand individuals survived to carry the future forward. And the event he pointed to as the likely cause of that crash was Toba. Sit with what that idea truly means. If Ambrose was right, then every person in that crowd of 8 billion, every face you will ever see, descends from a tiny frightened band of survivors who endured the darkest years our kind has ever known. The whole of human history that followed, every empire, every religion, every language, every song ever sung, would have flowed through a gap narrow enough to fit inside a single valley. It is a haunting picture, and for years it became one of the most repeated stories in all of human prehistory. The night the sky went dark, and the species that almost ended. But here is the part that almost no one ever hears. The story may be wrong, because as archaeologists went searching for the evidence, for the layer of death and abandonment this catastrophe should have stamped into the ground, they kept stumbling onto something else entirely. They kept finding life. On the southern coast of South Africa, at a site called Pinnacle Point, a team led by the archaeologist Curtis Marean uncovered something remarkable. Buried in the ancient soil, they found microscopic shards of volcanic glass, each one a chemical fingerprint that matched Toba itself, carried all the way from Sumatra to the very tip of Africa. For the first time, researchers could stand in a place where real human beings had lived and point to the precise moment the great eruption reached them. And then they looked carefully at what those humans were doing, both before that moment and after it. The answer was not what anyone expected. They were thriving. Could the disaster that supposedly almost erased our species have left some of its children barely disturbed? The people at Pinnacle Point did not vanish. They did not scatter. They did not collapse into the silence you would expect from a near extinction. The stone tools they shaped, the shellfish they pried from the rocks along the shore, the slow, steady rhythm of their daily lives, all of it carried straight through the eruption, and, by some measures, grew richer in the years that followed. Whatever gray winter fell across the wider world, this one stretch of warm southern coastline stayed fed enough and gentle enough to carry its people through unbroken. So which is the truth? Did Toba nearly end us? Or did we walk quietly through its long shadow and barely break our stride? The honest answer is that scientists are still arguing about it, and that very uncertainty is its own kind of revelation. Because notice something. Both versions of the story share the same astonishing core. Whether the cause was a single volcano or a slow-grinding ice age that stretched across tens of thousands of years, there really was a time when our entire kind teetered on the edge of nothing. The bottleneck written into your genes is real. The geneticists who study mitochondrial DNA, that tiny separate scrap of genetic code you inherit only and entirely from your mother, can follow your maternal line backward through thousands of generations. In a landmark study in 1987, the researchers Rebecca Cann and Allan traced the mitochondrial DNA of people from all over the world and found that every single thread converged on a small ancestral population in Africa. All the dazzling variety of our species today unspools from one remarkably thin strand. What that means is quietly overwhelming. You are not the product of a vast, secure, sprawling multitude. You are the product of a few. A precious, lucky, stubborn few. And that is the part of this story that should reach across 74,000 years and touch you, sitting exactly where you are right now. Think carefully about what your existence actually requires. The line that leads to you has never once broken, not during Toba's dark winters, not during the ice that ground across the world in the ages that came after. Not through the famines, the plagues, the predators, or the thousand quieter disasters that history never bothered to record. For 74,000 years, through every blackened sky and every failed harvest, someone in your direct ancestry survived just long enough to pass the spark of life forward to the next pair of hands. Every single one of them succeeded. Do you understand how staggering that is? If even one of them had failed at any point across that unimaginable stretch of time, you would simply not exist to wonder about any of it. You come from an unbroken chain of survivors. And so does the stranger sitting beside you. So does every face in that crowd of 8 billion. Our species spread across the entire surface of the planet, not because we were ever many, but because the few who remained refused to lie down and stop. They followed the coastlines. They crossed the deserts. They walked into lands no human eye had ever seen, carrying fire and language and grief and hope, and they did not stop walking until their descendants had touched nearly every shore on Earth. And maybe that is why the human story still feels the way it does. Why you can stand in a crowded city street, surrounded by more strangers in a single afternoon than your distant ancestors might have met in an entire lifetime, and still feel a strange, quiet kinship with a face you have never seen before. That feeling is not your imagination playing tricks on you. Underneath the 8 billion differences, there really is one ancient sameness, the faint genetic signature of a family, and maybe that is why the human story still feels the way it does. Why you can stand in a crowded city street, surrounded by more strangers in a single afternoon than your distant ancestors might have met in an entire lifetime, and still feel a strange, quiet kinship with a face you have never seen before. That feeling is not your imagination playing tricks on you. Underneath the 8 billion differences, there really is one ancient sameness, the faint genetic signature of a family that once shrank down to almost nothing, in the cold and the dark, and somehow chose to begin again. So the next time you find yourself swallowed up in a crowd, stop for a second and look around you. You are not one of 8 billion strangers. You are one of 8 billion survivors. Every one of you descended from the same handful who watched the sky go dark and lived long enough to see it clear.